Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight. My name is Lily Toto, and I run events for the Georgetown Club of Boston. I am Georgetown class of 2021, went to the college for undergrad and live in Boston now. Boston native, so I grew up in Wayland, Massachusetts my whole life, and super excited to be working for the club now and helping out with events. So for tonight, we have, as promised, Dr. Jason Brennan from the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. He'll be talking about charitable giving and what Americans often get wrong about it. He'll also be talking about the course that he teaches at Georgetown, how that relates. Mario, my friend here from 1970, class of 1970 at Georgetown, will be introducing him. So I will turn the floor over to Mario in a minute. But before that, I just wanted to give a little plug for the club. If you're not a member, please feel free to message me in the chat or reply to your email for this. We can set you up with a membership. And it's a really great club. We like to do a lot of events in Boston, both virtual and in person. You can join whether you're in the city or the suburbs in Massachusetts. So feel free to message me for more information about that if you're not currently a club member. So for the next 45 minutes, we'll have the floor over to Dr. Brennan. And then for the last 15 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session. Over to you, Mario.
All right, thanks. A little bit about Jason himself. He's the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor at the McDonough School of Business, the author of 16 books, which have been translated into 15 languages. He's also the editor of Public Affairs Quarterly and an associate editor of Social Philosophy and Policy. He has been interviewed on too many media outlets to mention here, but he's definitely actively engaged in social media as well. Currently overseeing a $2 million grant from the Templeton Foundation on markets, social entrepreneurship, and effective altruism. He recently also, which I find really fascinating, won the Provost Innovation and Teaching Award for the Ethics Project, an experiential long-term learning project that he himself invented. I give you Jason Brennan.
Cool. Thanks very much for having me here tonight. It's good to be talking to you. I wish we could do it in person. It's been a while since I've been back home. I'm actually from the Boston area myself. I grew up in Tewksbury for about 9 years, then lived in Hudson, New Hampshire. So when I tell people I'm from Boston when I'm not in Massachusetts. You know, the same thing I say I'm from DC when I'm not in Northern Virginia. And I'm very sad about the Bruins, but we won't talk about that. So with that, I'd like to talk to you about some of the stuff that I'm doing in my classes, including like what we talk about in terms of theory and about giving. So basically, as a roadmap for what our discussion is going to be about tonight, it's going to be about why people aren't that great at charitable giving. What goes wrong? Why aren't they very effective at it? What's motivating them to do it? We're going to kind of crack open people's skulls and look inside there and see what's going on in human nature. And partly because I teach a lot of courses on these things. I teach a class on social entrepreneurship and altruism. I teach another class called Managing Flawed People, which is all about sort of predicting what makes us act better or worse and how we can sort of use that information to make ourselves behave better. And so a lot of this material comes from those courses and the research that's related to it. So I'd like to start by talking about engagement rings. So, you know, back in 2002, I took my, at the time, girlfriend out to this like really nice park, Papago Park in Phoenix, Arizona, after we'd gone to see Taliesin West, which is, she's really into Frank Lloyd Wright. So we thought that'd be a great thing. We had this great romantic experience and I got down on a knee and I had this whole speech prepared about building the architecture of our lives together. And then I gave her, this isn't it, this is my ring, but a very expensive trinket. It cost me lots of money. Pretty much my entire first year fellowship from my grad studies went to buying this trinket for her. And then she said yes, and we're married, and here's our house, and she's away right now. She's doing some stuff, but you know, we have 2 kids, and it's been 22 years later. So we've been together a long time. Why did I do that? What was the point of giving her this expensive trinket? Well, there is a point to it. It's not just simply because De Beers did some marketing or because there's a monopoly or because of this or that or just social inertia. There's actually a point to giving engagement rings. And the point is to solve an information problem. You see, talk is cheap. It's really easy to just say to somebody, and driving in the car once, like I think in Princeton, I went, what do you think about, should we get married? And she's like, yeah, we should probably get married, but it was just talking, right? But the fact that I'm willing to spend a crap ton of money that I barely have to sort of ask her to marry me is very strong proof to her, social proof that I'm dedicated, right? Because she doesn't know how sincere is this person. It's also proof to me, right? Because I might be, do I really want to spend the rest of my life? Like the fact that I'm willing to spend lots of money is evidence, right? It also might be evidence of some degree of financial stability if you can afford to do that. So you can imagine an alternative universe that instead of, say, giving an engagement ring, you burn $5,000 while cutting yourself open and bleeding for an hour, right? It would sort of serve the same purpose. Isn't that beautiful? That's like kind of what it's for. So this is signaling. Signaling is something we do when we have information problems and you can't just state what you believe. People might not have reason to trust you. So you have to do something to sort of prove to them you really mean what you mean. And I want to argue that today that this is pervasive and a lot of our charitable giving is actually explained by. So how do we think that? So I want to tell you about one of my favorite books. It's a book called The Elephant in the Brain by the economist Robin Hanson and the computer scientist Kevin Simler. I was a referee for this book when it was at Oxford, and I remember refereeing and thinking, I thought what they were talking about in this book was true maybe 5% of the time. They convinced me it's all over. So this is basically the thesis of the book. They say, our brains are designed to act upon hidden motives. When we introspect, when we read our own minds, what we see are beautiful motives. I, Jason Brennan, am motivated by love and compassion and divinity and cooperation and kindness and progress. That's what I see when I look in my mind. That's what you see when you look in your mind. But deep underneath that are kind of uglier motives, desires for power and sex and status and resources and money. And we don't see that when we look in our own minds. What we see are the beautiful motives. Their claim, which you shouldn't believe me yet, I've given you no evidence this is true, is that we're acting upon these hidden motives, but we trick ourselves into thinking we're acting upon the good motives. And the reason we do this, they say, is because we're very good at reading other people's minds. So because we're so good at it, what our brains have done has evolved a mechanism to trick other people. We trick other people by tricking ourselves. When they read our minds, what they see are the nice things, and they don't see the bad things. So we trick ourselves in order to trick other people. It's an intriguing thesis, but you don't have any reason to believe it yet. What would be the evidence for it? How would you prove it? How would you even show this? So to be clear, here's what they don't do. What they don't do is say, anytime someone does something nice, you can explain it by a selfish motive. So for instance, if you pull a drowning child out of a pool and save his life, we could imagine you're doing it because you want fame or fortune. We can always come up with a story. That's not what they're doing. That would be a really lousy argument. It's bad philosophy to do that. Instead, what they say is, let's look at every single sphere of human activity and make predictions. Let's start by assuming people are genuinely trying to achieve the goal of that activity. So if education is about learning, what would that predict about how people consume information and how they consume higher education? If charity is about helping, what would that predict about how they give money? If art is about beauty, what would that predict about what they do with regard to art? So let's start by making a bunch of predictions, and then let's imagine they actually have these nasty motives instead. What would that predict about their behavior? And then we go and look and see what behavior they have. And then whatever holds up, what tells the best story. So over and over again, they claim that you tend to see lots and lots of the stuff is explained by the dark and hidden motives rather than the good motives. So for instance, I'm a professor. When I cancel classes, how do you think my students feel? Are they bothered? No one ever has emailed me and said, I'm paying, $270,000 to go here. It's really expensive now. I'm paying $270,000 to go here, which works out to be, $300 per hour. So when you cancel class, you are robbing me of $300 worth of information. They're totally fine with it. They don't care at all. If they were there to learn as much as possible, they would be maybe not mad at me, but mad at my colleagues when they do it, but they're not, right? But some of their other behavior starts to make sense. I actually ask my students, I teach a freshman class, I say, would you rather graduate from Georgetown having learned nothing, or learn 3 times as much as a typical Georgetown student, but get no degree? Which would you prefer? What do you think? What do you think they say? The degree?
No degree.
Yeah. They all say they'd rather have the degree and learn nothing than to get the degree and learn a lot. Or sorry, than to not get the degree and learn a lot. So that starts to say, okay, well, maybe they're there for something other than just learning. So let's look at animals other than humans to see some weird behavior, and then note that we're animals too, and then talk about what this might mean for us. So one thing is, you might know that chimpanzees and apes and monkeys and so on that live in social groups spend a lot of time grooming each other. And there are actually people, not at Georgetown, but elsewhere, who spend time watching these animals and then cleaning them themselves, trying to figure out how long does it take to get a monkey clean. And it turns out that depending on which species of ape or monkey you're looking at, they spend somewhere between 30 to 170 times as much time grooming each other as is necessary to be clean. They don't groom animals more. It doesn't take longer when the animal's bigger. It doesn't take longer when the animal's dirty. What actually determines how long they spend grooming the other animal is if they're trying to form a coalition with them, how close they are in the hierarchy, and sort of social status. They groom high status individuals more than low status individuals. They groom animals that are in an alliance with them more than others. So grooming is partly about making animals clean, but it's largely about forming coalitions with one another, right? It's not only for this one purpose. Another thing that happens, there's a thing called competitive altruism. So babbler birds, there's a babbler bird right there, they live in communities with one another, and they will actually fight each other to help each other. So let's say like Mario is in pain, and Andrew and I see that he's in pain, and we want to give him like some help. Imagine we start punching each other in order to be the one that gives him the Tylenol. It'd be a weird thing to do, but babbler birds do that. They try to fight each other in order to be the one that provides assistance to the other animals. And that seems weird until you realize when you are the one that helps the other animals, this gives you increased mating opportunities. It makes it more likely that those animals will help you in the future. So they are competing to form alliances. Their altruistic behavior is highly competitive. It's prestige-based. They're trying to look good to the other animals, right? One thing about humans and other apes is that in order for us to succeed, we have to form coalitions with other people. We don't just succeed on our own. We're always working with others. We're always cooperating. We can do very little on our own. By ourselves, we're basically useless. As I like to point out in my classes, and this isn't original to me, but even something as simple as this little pin, if you ask how many people does it take to make this, it's something like 50 million. There's something like 50 million people in the world that helped produce this pin. And if you were to take a typical engineer and put them on a planet by themselves, they wouldn't live long enough to make one of these, right? So what happens here? Humans are cooperative animals. We evolved to be cooperative. We evolved to have a moral sense. We evolved to live in small family clans of roughly 100 members to 120 members, where the groups depended heavily on solidarity within the group and had a lot of enmity with outgroups. And because of this, we've evolved to accept certain moral norms about being fair, not cheating, distributing resources, and so on. But so we all kind of, in a sense, have evolved to be moral animals, but we also benefit from cheating on the margins, right? We all sort of selfishly benefit if I'm this good, but people see me as this good, that's beneficial to me selfishly. It'd be great to be sort of a C in ethics, but be seen as an A, because how people treat you depends on how reliable and trustworthy they think you are. So it'd be really great for you is if people, from a selfish standpoint, is if you were, kind of a scoundrel, but everyone thought you were wonderful, right? If you ever read like Republic while you're at Georgetown in one of those intro classes, playing as Republic, that's what that book is about. Is it better to be seen as good or to actually be good, right? It's a long classic question. However, the problem is human beings are really good at reading one another's minds. We have all these neurons, like mirror neurons, where we can look at a person's face and we know what they're feeling. We're good at detecting lies. I play a game in one of my classes called Lie Detector, where I have people tell each other stories. It's like two truths and a lie, but they get to ask questions. And then at the end, they have to guess which story is fake and which one's real. And generally speaking, about 80% of the students figure out what the lie is. We're pretty good at detecting falsehoods, especially in the long run. We're pretty good at reading people's minds. So if you really want to selfishly benefit yourself the most, what you want is a mind that looks good to others when they're engaging in mind reading. The problem is that, so the optimum kind of strategy is like to be kind of a cheater, but not to get caught, right? But if people are mind readers, what do? You engage in self-deception. Your subconscious mind might trick you into thinking you have better motives than you actually have. When you look introspect, you see good things, but what's actually going on are maybe darker things. So another way of thinking about this is that perhaps the subconscious mind is sort of like the press secretary of the brain. Its job is to make you look good to others, right? Why believe that? Well, we could go through all sorts of field, and again, the evidence for this is to go field by field and make predictions about people's behavior. Let's look at charitable giving as one example. There's only one example. I'm happy to talk about others, but let's look at this one. One thing to note is that when it comes to charitable giving, people are not really that good at helping. It's surprising because Americans and others give a lot of money, they volunteer a lot, but the stuff that they do often doesn't really do much good. So maybe a slogan for this would be something like this. If you really want to help people, it's not the thought that counts, it's the helping. But if you want to believe, get other people to think you're helpful, then it's the thought that counts. I have here a picture of these devices. You might have seen these before. These are called play pumps. This is a charity that had this idea that, well, in certain parts of the world, you have these wells and they require old-fashioned pumping with your arm. And as people get old, it's harder and harder to do that. You have these, little old people who are barely any strength left and they're having to pump water in an old-fashioned way. What if we install these merry-go-rounds and the children will play on them for fun? And then as a byproduct, as they spin these things around, they will fill this device up here with water, pump water up in there. It's a really neat idea, and it didn't work. The problem is a lot of this technology is proprietary and it's really difficult to repair. They have to enclose a well a certain way. And then as the parts wear out, it's difficult to replace them. They might not have the funding for that. The average person cannot repair the well. And once this stuff corrodes, unless the company itself comes in there and replaces it, it basically becomes a useless well. It also turns out that children don't play with these nearly as much as they suspected. So this ends up being an example of a charity that was intending to do good, but in fact makes the world worse. Another example of this would be, have you ever heard of something called Scared Straight? Right? You might have seen a TV show about this. There's an award-winning, I think Oscar-winning documentary about this in the 80s. Scared Straight, what it does is it takes young men, usually, I think sometimes women, but usually young men between the ages of like 13, or maybe actually about 12 to 18, who are starting to become criminogenic, engaging in criminal behavior. They bring them to a prison where prisoners yell at them and swear at them and threaten them, basically saying like, if you come to prison, I will abuse you. And the hope is that this will scare the hell out of these kids so they won't actually engage in criminal behavior. It turns out it backfires. And the way you test that is they basically have lottery systems to get into Scared Straight. So you don't want to just compare the kids who go to Scared Straight with everybody else because there's a selection effect. That'd be like comparing Georgetown undergraduates to just random people, right? We have selectivity. What you do is you compare everyone who is sort of meets the criteria, who applies for it, who could be in it, but they don't have enough space. So some people win the lottery and go in, and otherwise identical kids who are also getting into trouble don't get in. Then you see who actually goes through the process and who doesn't. And the people who go through Scared Straight turn out to be much more likely to commit crime and end up in jail than otherwise identical people who don't. It's so bad that one estimate in the economic literature thinks that every dollar you donate to Scared Straight creates $200 worth of social harm, right? It'd be better to burn your money than to give it to Scared Straight. Or one final example would be another that we all probably know about is DARE. Right. When I was in middle school middle school and early high school in the 1990s, I had to go through the DARE program. It turns out that DARE makes people more likely to use drugs. It backfires. The mechanism is actually kind of obvious when you think about it. What you do is you go up to 13-year-olds and go, hey, all of your friends are doing drugs. Hey, you, the person who really wants to fit in with everybody, everybody's doing drugs, but don't. Well, they do more drugs. That's what happens. All right. So maybe another way of putting this is my dissertation supervisor, David Schmitz. One of his aphorisms is, if your goal is to show your heart is in the right place, then your heart is not in the right place. So what goes wrong with charity? What's going on there? There's problems inside of charity as it's constructed, and there's also problems with our motivations with regard to charity. So one problem is that charities have kind of a management issue. The issue is that the customer and the beneficiary are not the same. The customer is the donor, the person who's giving you the money. In order to continue, you have to get those people, make them people happy, but they might not be the people you're benefiting. And as a result, it's different from, say, Chipotle. For Chipotle to succeed, it has to get people to continue eating there. The people who are eating the food are the ones that pay. They have to think that the food is worth their money or they stop. But a charity might not. The people it's benefiting are often people who don't have any money or any resources, but the people who are paying are people who do. So when you have the choice between what's good for them and what the people who are paying think is good, you often do what looks good rather than what is good. This might be an example. Lily, this will probably matter more to you than the others, since you're clearly like a recent person. We're building new buildings all the time on Georgetown's campus, but there's still mold in the old dorms, isn't there? Right? Because no one wants to fund the remediation fund. They want to fund things like a new building that's cool, right? No one wants to pay for toilet paper, but they do want to pay for wings of buildings and things like that. There's also a philosophical problem of charity, which is, how do you know you're adding value to the world, right? So a charity consumes inputs and it creates outputs. How do you know that you've created value? How do you measure the value of what you've consumed and the value of what you put out? When you're running a for-profit business, if it's in a reasonably competitive market with reasonable business ethics, and you don't have any major externalities, the market does it for you because prices are a function of other people's desires and knowledge. But the problem with a charity is you don't have a pricing mechanism. So how do you know if my charity spends $10,000 and 500 hours of work to feed 60 homeless people once each? Is that adding value to the world? Is it losing value? How would I know? How would I price the value of their food? You know, you can't just say feeding a homeless person is priceless, because that money that we spend on that could be spent on something else that's also priceless, like art or whatever. So these are two big problems that charities face. I'm not saying they can't be overcome, but they are problems. What else is wrong with a lot of our giving? One thing to note is that we often have a focus on giving locally, but when you give locally, we're giving to people who are pretty well off, all things considered. I don't want to downplay poverty in the United States. I'm not here to say that it's not a big deal, but one thing to note is that Americans that are poor are still fairly rich by world standards. An American who is at the poverty line in the United States, which is defined at about $13,800, is adjusting for the cost of living, adjusting for the fact that it's more expensive to live in the US than most other places, is still within the top 20% of income earners worldwide, right? So if you're giving a laptop to, say, a poor student in DC, that's a nice thing to do, but they're still quite well off compared to a lot of people in the world. Median per capita income in Liberia is maybe $450 to $600, whereas in the US, it's probably about $40,000. Right? So one thing to note about that is if you have this idea that giving to rich people matters less than giving to poor people, the people around us that we're helping are often quite rich. They're quite well off compared to others. We also often don't select very cost-effective strategies. Like, so for instance, suppose you want to help blind people. Well, if it costs about $50,000 to train a guide dog for a blind person in the United States, if you want to restore blind or fix blindness, you can donate about $50 to Sight Savers, and they will cure a person of blindness from trachoma. Right? So these are a more effective way of doing that very same thing. Now, I'm not saying necessarily you have to do these things, but they're things to think about. It turns out that most people don't have this on the mind. There's a bunch of research looking into what makes people give and what makes them don't. And the reality is that if you ask people, hey, does the effectiveness of your charity matter? Basically, everybody says yes. Who's going to say no? I don't care if it helps. Who cares? I just give money to them. They're maybe killing people for all. No one's going to say that, of course. Of course, they're not going to say it. But does it actually matter? In the reality, roughly about 2/3 of people will actually do any kind of internet search to try to check on the effectiveness of their charity, but only about 3 out of 100 will change their charitable giving in light of evidence that their charity does not work. So that gives you kind of an upper bound, like what percentage of people are effective altruists in a very minimum sense, maybe 3 out of 100. Most people are just kind of going on their gut feelings and what seems good. Here's some other evidence for this. Humans suffer from this thing called scope insensitivity. So there's a bunch of experiments showing this, and you get the same results every time. Imagine I'm going up to people saying, my charity will save the lives of various birds, whatever your favorite bird is. We save those birds' lives. They're dying in mass and we'll help them. I tell some people, if you give us $1,000, we will save 2,000 birds. I tell other people, if you give us $1,000, we will save 20,000 birds. I tell a third group of people, if you give us $1,000, we will save 200,000 birds. If people were really concerned about effectiveness, you would expect that the more birds I save, the more money we get, and the higher rate of entry, like how more people would agree to actually give. That's not what you find. In fact, it turns out that regardless of whether you're saving a few, a lot, or a hell of a lot, the same number of people will give, and they'll give about the same amount. They are what we call scope insensitive. Very little money in the US goes towards the global poor. It mostly goes to local things. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's worth noting we're not necessarily helping the people who need it the most. What actually makes people give are things like this: visibility. We give more when we're being watched. We give more when we're peer pressured to give by others. That's why you probably get calls from like the alumni office or something, and you might get like a letter from like a classmate saying, I gave them money, you should give them money too. I once saw the CEO of Overstock.com at a party stand up and say he was going to give $1 million to a charity, and he was around a bunch of other rich people, and then they all did it in response to him. We give more when we're close to people. We give more when we can kind of see them as people and know their stories. We also give more when we're thinking about sex and mating. So the evidence for that. So here's some examples. You might have seen this kind of thing before, where someone will have tiers of giving. You know, if you give $100, you're the bronze giver, 250, you're a silver giver, $1,000, you're a platinum giver. It turns out that people will almost always give exactly the amount to meet that tier. And it works too. Putting people's names on this and rewarding them makes them more likely to give. It also turns out that very few people give anonymously. When you see on a brochure that says like someone gave an anonymous $1 million donation to a charity, almost all the time that person's friends know they gave them money. Genuine anonymous giving is very rare. Peer pressure. Think about charity dinners and alumni and friend solicitation. Most donations come from friends soliciting other friends to give. People rarely just give on their own without something like that. Proximity. When we can relate to something, we give more. So you might have heard, Stalin didn't actually say this, but it's a nice kind of encapsulation of human nature just by him not actually saying this. He says, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic. The point of this is, we are not capable of really thinking about 1 million people dying and feeling bad about that. What we feel bad about is when we see one thing. An example would be like, I remember, it was in 11th grade, they showed us this old movie from England in the 1980s called Threads, which displayed a nuclear war. And Sheffield, England, where the home of Def Leppard, gets nuked, and millions of people are dying, and no one was sad. But then they showed a cat about to be burnt to death, and everyone in the room cried. Now, in our heads, we know that millions of people dying is worse than one cat dying, but the one cat's the thing that activated us. That is how we evolved. We evolved to live in these small family clans with a lot of face-to-face interaction, but now we cooperate on the scale of billions. But our architecture of our brains has not caught up to that. As a result, this is why when you have when you get a brochure from a charity, it will start with a picture of a smiling person and like a story of that one person. Anecdotal reasoning. We all know anecdotal reasoning is bad, but this is how they sell you on it. If they give you any statistics about their effectiveness, which they probably don't, they're in the back of the brochure because those don't work. They don't convince people. What convinces people are smiling. People also give more when they're primed to think about mating. Like, so for instance, there's all these experiments on this point. Like if you have people go around soliciting others to give donations and the person doing the soliciting is good looking, people give at a much higher rate and they give much more than if they're not good looking. There's another experiment on this, and there's a variety of these where they'll divide people into two groups. Half of them, they'll have them just hang out for 10 minutes. And the other half, they have them imagine a good first date. And then as they leave, they go, oh, by the way, we're collecting money for UNICEF. Would you like to donate? Guess what? The people who spent 10 minutes thinking about a first date give at a much higher rate than the people who don't. So a lot of it might be like, I'm trying to signal to other people I'm a good, kind person. And when you start thinking about sex and things like that, you start becoming more giving. A lot of what might be going on here is conspicuous giving. Conspicuous giving is sort of like conspicuous consumption, right? So if you have, say, a Swiss watch or a BMW, I have a BMW. Thank you, Georgetown, for buying that for me. I have a Swiss watch too, actually. So this is me, right? I have a Swiss watch. I have a BMW. I have some nice stuff. I have like expensive guitars. And some of that is for the actual use of it, but a lot of it is to sort of display to people that you have a certain degree of wealth. You're a certain kind of person. You went to Georgetown. A lot of that is about showing you're the certain kind of person. I often ask my students, how much, like, imagine you could get exactly the same education at Georgetown versus UMass Amherst. Would you still rather go to Georgetown? And everyone's like, yeah, if they were the same price, of course I would. Well, why? Well, because people will think you're a certain kind of person if you have the Georgetown credential, right? They're going to engage in this kind of statistical discrimination on your behalf. This is a kind of conspicuous consumption. I'm not bashing it. Thank you. My career depends upon you guys doing this. So I'm certainly not criticizing it at all. But when we do this, we're advertising things like wealth, right? So similarly, when we engage in conspicuous giving, we're doing advertising. I'm wealthy. Look at how wealthy I am. I can throw money away at helping other people. I'm a nice person. As proof, I'm giving money to other people. You should be my friend. You should hang out with me. I'm trustworthy. I'm empathetic. I'm caring. It's really on par with wearing Red Sox gear around Boston. Like when I'm back home and I wear that kind of stuff, strangers will come up to me in the bar and talk to me because I'm wearing that clothing. Or if I'm wearing it here, people from the Boston area will talk to me because they're like, oh, you're a Red Sox fan. You must be from Boston. Like, let's talk. And they'll be my friend, right? Money works like that too. And even when you're giving to others, right? So that's kind of problematic. Charity has some issues, and that doesn't mean it's bad. Lots of charities are good. Some are worse than others. Some are better than others. But let's talk about some alternatives to charity that might deliver some of the same goods. One of the things I mentioned to you was the problem that when you have a charitable organization, the people who give you money and the people you're trying to serve are different. And sometimes the thing that's of use to the people you're serving is not what the donors care about. A nice example is if you think about an art museum, they're often really badly laid out and hard to walk around. And it doesn't make any sense until you recognize, oh, wait a minute, this was designed for the donors to have wedding parties there at night when it's closed. Then suddenly it makes sense, right? And I'm not making that up, that's true. That's really what goes on is the architecture. When you walk around Georgetown, you're like, why won't they fix the mold in the dorms, but they're still building these new things that are like really high stats? Well, that's what the donors are willing to pay for. So there's something called social business. The idea behind social business is, what if you try to deliver the goods that a charity is trying to deliver, but do it through business mechanisms? And the idea behind this is, we're going to make our beneficiaries the customer. Instead of it being, I have to convince a rich person to give me money to help this person, I'm going to try to help that person by providing a product or a service that they can afford to pay and are willing to pay. And they'll only continue to pay for it if I continue to provide that. And the market will commensurate all the values for me. That requires me to stay in business, that I take things that the world values this much and turn it into something my customers value this much. And if I can do that, I might be able to stay in business. So maybe a difference here would be, a charity might say something like, too many poor people don't have laptops, and as a result, they're not succeeding in school. Can we convince rich people to buy us laptops to give to them? A social business would go, there are a lot of poor people who can't afford laptops. Can we figure out how to make a laptop that's cost effective that they can afford? And because they are a customer, we are beholden to them. We will only stay in business if we make a product that they continue to buy, that they like, that they will talk to others about, and so on. Right? I'm not saying that this is a miraculous thing that fixes everything, but it's sometimes an alternative to traditional charity that sometimes overcomes some of the problems of it. So with that, I'm giving you kind of a very quick crash course into some of the, uncomfortable things about human nature and ways in which we're not quite as good as we might hope we are. I want to talk to you a little bit about like what I'm doing in some of my classes that's maybe having people implement some of these ideas and learn from it and learn from personal experience. So I have a very simple project that I do in all of my classes called the Ethics Project. It's got that name because it's meant to be incredibly generic. All right, that's on purpose. This is what it's really about. So back a few years ago, our previous dean, David Thomas, said that the mission of Georgetown's McDonough School is to create principled leaders in service to business and society. And that's a great mission. It's definitely better than creating unprincipled leaders or principled followers or unprincipled followers. Principled leaders is definitely the way to go. But how do we do that? Well, one of the problems with business education is that a lot of it is centered around case studies. We give people a story and we say, imagine a manager in the following circumstance, what's going wrong and what should they do? These things are worth doing. I'm not denigrating them. I use them too, but they have limits. One of the limits is you're not actually in the circumstance. So it's one thing to say, oh, well, you should, would you engage in accounting fraud when there's nothing there? You're not in the circumstance. You don't feel the temptation, right? You're not actually the person there. So it's easy from the cool space of your armchair to think through what's wrong and what to do because nothing is at stake for you. Further, they come pre-labeled. If you're taking an accounting class and a week ago you covered accounting fraud and the professor comes in and gives you a case study, you go, I bet this is an accounting case study and I bet it has something to do with accounting fraud, right? In the real world, when you encounter problems, they do not come labeled like this. There isn't like an announcement, hey, you're in a moral dilemma right now, or a business dilemma or a strategic dilemma. You just are in it. And you might not even be aware of it. You might simply like walk your way through it and you know what kind of dilemma it is. And further, something is actually at stake. I'm really good at avoiding the temptation to eat hypothetical M&Ms. But actual M&Ms in front of me, that's a different story, right? I'm really good at the temptation to avoid buying hypothetical guitars I don't need. But when I walk into Guitar Center, I think I could use a lot more of these things, right? That's how we are. So let me give you an example of a project people did, and I'll tell you a little bit about what it's about. All I ask students to do is think of something good to do and do it. Working in groups, think of something good to do over the course of a semester, and then go and do that. And then I give them a series of questions to use to analyze the project, to plan it, and to analyze it after it's done. So an example of this would be, right here is a guy named Febin Bellamy. He won the highest service award from Georgetown's MSB when he graduated a few years ago. And he had this idea of, well, we have all these blue collar staff at Georgetown who never get any recognition. You know, like I have a Flanagan family professorship, one of the trustees endowed a chair, and I get that, so I get recognition. I create a class, I get an award, they post things about, they have stories about me. But who talks about the people who are actually making the campus run, the people that have to be there every single day that are keeping it running? Not anyone. So it's like, what if we kind of celebrate them and reward them? And then he thought with his group, what if we did more than that? What if we almost create, and this is effectively what they did, a Make-A-Wish Foundation for these people. And so over the course of a semester, and then it became a club that lasted his entire time and even outlasted him after he graduated, they would raise money and do things like help this guy create a business. He wanted to like make a Jamaican jerk sandwich business, and he did that. They raised $5,000 to send one of our janitors back to his home country where he hadn't been in 40 years. And then they spread this to other universities. It became a club at about 10 other schools. Unfortunately, COVID, when everyone was away for 2 years, seemed to kill it, and most of the clubs at other schools. But it lasted for like 6 years, just this project in class. Think of something good to do and do it. And this is what they came up with, right? So the idea here is, instead of having students role play case studies, I'm having them create and live through and learn from their own case studies, genuine ethical issues, genuine ethical dilemmas that arise as a result of their strategic decision-making and their planning. Not something I created for them, not an artificial thing, nothing that comes pre-labeled, real life experience that they will live through because of their decisions and learn from as best they can. All right, so one thing is that we actually give every single group $1,000 to do this. I was pretty lucky that one of my colleagues had raised a bunch of money from different groups. Some alumni ended up just giving us money at random. And then recently I got $2.1 million from the Templeton Foundation. So now we're having all MBAs do this as well. So we're pretty lucky that we can do this. And we just say, here's $1,000 and you can think about what you want to do with it. And some of the reasons for this is that I'm really trying to like activate adult learning. It turns out adults learn a lot more from experience than from lecturing. They learn more when they have autonomy and they make real decisions for themselves. I want to give students freedom to think about what they want to do and what's worthwhile to them. And then I didn't realize this when I created it, but it's a very Jesuit project at the end of the day, because if you think about what makes the Jesuits distinct, it's about reflective action. And that's what this is. It's deliberate about something you want to do, then go and do it, and then reflect upon what you learn. And when I talk about reflection, these are the questions I tell students ahead of time I want them to answer. I say, plan your project with these questions in mind. And when you do a presentation, you're going to need to answer these questions. So I ask them things like, how did you interpret the imperative to do something good? Did you focus on moral goodness or non-moral goodness? So, moral goodness would be like saving lives, and non-moral goodness would be like a really great guitar. How did you decide between the trade-off about what's the most desirable thing you can do and what's actually feasible? So something might have like a really grand idea you're not sure if you can do, or something that's more mundane you can pull off. How did you navigate that? What was the next best thing that you could have done? Why did you pick this project over the other projects you could have done? What obstacles did you expect to encounter, and how did you plan for them? Which is a bit of a nudge. It's like, hey, you will have obstacles. Think about them now and plan for them so they won't get in your way. And then also, what obstacles did you in fact encounter, and how did you respond to them? How did you overcome them? Did you overcome them? Did you add value to the world, taking into account the cost of your time and your effort, any money spent? So I actually asked them to do kind of a cost-benefit analysis of their project. Like, if you spend 400 hours and $1,000 to feed one homeless person once, did that add value or subtract it? How would you know? And then a separate question, notice this is separate. Did you succeed or fail, and by what standards should we judge you? And finally ask them, what did you learn and what would you do differently? All right. So because of this, they encounter all sorts of real life business ethics problems. They have issues with forming their groups and allocating labor. Sometimes they have to deal with a bureaucracy that's indifferent or hostile or just simply busy. They've got other things to do. There isn't a full-time staff here to help them with this. They have red tape. A lot of times students are very idealistic and they think, I have good intentions, I'll just fix everything. And then they find out in the real world that to do something requires permission. You can't just start a business. You can't just run a charity. You can't just spend the money. So the money that we give them is governed by the rules that govern Georgetown as 503B or whatever it is that we are. We can't spend money on just anything. We can't say give $1,000 to a charity. They can't either as a result. They have logistics and timing issues. They have to think about how they're going to advertise what they're doing. If they're going to sell something, what will it take? Are they competing with other groups? Oftentimes they're competing with other groups to do a project. They're competing for space and time and so on. They have to experiment and learn from these things. So they deal with real life business ethics issues. So here's some examples of the projects that people have done. I told you about Unsung Heroes, which is originally Unsung Hoyas, a Make-A-Wish kind of foundation for blue collar workers. A few years ago, there were the tragic Macoa mudslides in Colombia. My students on their own raised about $27,000. They didn't even use our money. They raised $27,000 and loaded 3 trucks full of supplies that they put the supplies and they decided what the supplies would be and sent them to the mudslide victims in waves. So they would get the supplies they needed immediately after it took place, then what they would need a month after, and then 2 months after, based upon like what they need. Some MBA students last year put in a water filtration system for about 300 people in a village called Malik in Haiti. They went and put in the water system themselves. So now 300 people are getting clean water because 4 MBAs decided they could do it. The most successful business we ever had was called Hoya Screen Repair. They learned how to repair iPhone and iPad screens, and they ran this business. And even after they graduated, it existed for about another 2 years. And I can't remember the exact amount they grossed, but it was something like over $100,000, I think, with like a 30% margin. It was a massive business. My first time I ever did this, we had a group called Adopt a Sister. And what they did was they bought an oil press machine and sent it to these 4 teenage girls in Africa that they've been working with, and gave them a business plan for how they could crush oil from a plant, crush plants in their area to get this oil that they could then sell for money, and it dramatically increased the income of their families. We had things as simple as students repaired water heaters in one of the dorms, so that instead of the students turning on the cold water and letting it run for 10 minutes before they came back to the showers, they would turn them on, and then it would only take a minute for the hot water to come on. And it worked out to be like something like $20,000 a semester of water saved. And then they said to the university, you should copy us. And they were like, you're right. And they did. They probably won't be happy with you saying that. Even most recently during COVID times, a bunch of the students got the university to change the rules about allowing people to stay on campus over winter break, because it was really hard to, you might get stuck in Hong Kong because of how difficult it is to re-enter the US. They managed in a 2-month period to get the university to revise its policies on this. I wanted to get a policy revised. It took me 5 years to do it. So I don't know how they managed to do that, but they're better at it than I am. Most recently, we have similar success stories even from this year with fundraisers for SIVA, mattress rental business, art events, and so on. They come up with really creative and innovative things, and some mundane things as well. Everything from really mundane stuff to really impressive stuff, and also some things that fail. And then also, thanks to the Templeton Foundation, we're seeding this at about 19 other universities, including the other ones here. I'm giving them each a couple $1,000s each. And they're having their students do the same thing. And the hope is that other universities are going to copy this process because it's effective. Instead of me telling students to write a paper on some topic I find interesting, I say, you think of what's good to do, go and do it, and tell us what you learned from it, taking these abstract concepts that we learn in class and apply them to actual decision making, and then explaining what it all means to everybody else. So with that, I know that's a lot, but that's sort of an overview of what goes wrong in giving? Why aren't we very good at it? What are some of the impediments to giving? And then how can we do it better? And how are we trying to teach people to do it better ourselves and become more effective at this stuff here on campus? So again, thanks very much for listening to me talk to you about this. I know there was a lot, and I'm really happy to take any questions or comments you have about this or anything related to it.
First, full disclosure, I am a fundraiser at international nonprofits based in DC, but we won't get into it. So it's for the environment. So what you're talking about, giving to things, it's actually much harder to get someone to give to an abstract, even policy related, which is what I do. I'm just curious about the examples of the projects that you were talking about. Are the outcomes and what the students learned, what worked, what didn't work, is that available to share to non-current students like myself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do have a write-up about this it's a bit verbose because had to publish in a journal that required a certain style of writing that's not really mine. But I do have some materials about this that talk about some of these experiences and some of these outcomes. So yeah, I'd be happy to share that with you afterwards. So we do have some public materials. We'll probably prepare more as we go. I think at the end of the Templeton Foundation grant, like we're going to make like a big document, everything the MBA students do. Yeah, the policy stuff is, by the way, really interesting because, as you said, it's easy to get people to donate to people. It's harder to, like, the more distant it is from a direct outcome, the harder it is to get people to do something, even though oftentimes those are the things that have the biggest leverage and the biggest impact. So yeah, I'm sure you're seeing that firsthand, and I'm telling you when I'm saying this, I'm saying something for the benefit of everybody else, perhaps.
Even I worked at an organization, my last job, where we literally planted trees in the ground, and it was not any easier, surprisingly. So, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Camille.
Hi, I was just wondering, so when you are going over the results or the impact with of the projects with your student groups, are you bringing in, people who might be able to speak to that efficacy from, like a real life perspective? Like, for example, I've worked in healthcare for over 10 years, and, I could tell you 1,000 different ways that patients and families need support, but I can also tell you that everyone knows about cancer, so everyone donates to cancer. And what ends up happening is oncology is, flooded with funding, but unfortunately that goes usually specifically to oncology patients.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, one thing we cover, I talked about a couple elements of effective altruism, but one of the ideas behind it is to look for underfunded, neglected topics, things that are not very sexy, things that are not on people's minds, right? And those are often the places where, like, you can really do the most good. So people think about cancer, they don't think about deworming kids in India, even though you can show them, like, giving kids a 50-cent pill that will get rid of worms for massive impact on their health. So I think my students, because we cover that in class, they're often really aware of that, and they try to look for less obvious places, not to put money where other people are doing it. Sometimes just because of, from an economic perspective, this thing called diminishing marginal returns. I guess I should do like this for you. Diminishing marginal returns, right? Every dollar you give to a particular input should produce a little bit less output. So it might very well be that this particular charity has done amazing good, but they don't have any more room for funding. They've already kind of done their good they're going to do. So I think my students do tend to be pretty good about looking for the less obvious stuff. As far as proving what's the impact, this is why this project is so easy for me in a way. I told them that's their responsibility. I say, you are going to have to try to figure out, how do you measure your impact? How do you measure it reliably? What are the confounds? How would you know? So like, remember the first time I did this, like, people said, well, we raised awareness. We raised, 500 people heard about this. And I said, great, you're marketing majors. What's the value of that awareness? You learn how to do that. Tell me what the value is. And they're like, oh yeah, that's right. We know how to monetize. Like, so I actually asked them to, like, prove it. Like, what is your evidence that this thing that you're doing is going to be good for people? It could be something as simple as, this is a more mundane project, but students installed a bunch of hammocks around campus, right? But they did surveys to figure out how much people are going to use it. They installed them, they measured the amount of use. They tried to figure out what the consumption value was based upon, like, how much money people are willing to spend on hammocks when they're in similar kinds of objects and relaxation. They looked at psychological studies about the value of relaxation. And it's like, this isn't the whole story. It's not definitive, but it's enough to be able to say, we spent this much money, these are going to last this amount of time, and it's definitely a positive impact, not a loss of money, right? Or sometimes students, they installed in one dormitory a laundry bin system because people just, like, throw the clothes on the floor, and they fixed that. But they really measured, well, how much, like, are people actually using it, and how many fewer washes does that mean, and so on. So some things are easier than others. When it's like, we measured how much, like, people were having the water run for 10 minutes, now they're having it run for about a minute. That we can kind of just do some simple math and put a price on it because we have to pay for the water. And sometimes it's more complex. But the nice thing about this is I just push it back to them and say, we'll cover techniques about this in class, about how you look for this stuff. We'll shadow pricing and other things, but you have to prove it. And then they go and do it. And frankly, I wish more charities would do that as well. They really become very evidence-based in their giving, which makes them very reflective, because sometimes they think of something and they're like, you know, we thought this was a good idea, but we really looked into it and we're like, it's just not worth the price that we're paying. And we could do this other thing that has such a big bang for the buck. So great, thanks for that. I think I saw Mario, then Judy, and then Megan, then Andrew.
Wow. So Jason, have you been able to collect any data from the students that you've taught about how this project is influencing their future studies or career choices? How much of an impact has it had on them, and how much of it do you think they've internalized that it can definitely affect their decision making in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and frankly, I haven't.
No, right. I had a feeling you did, but I was just curious that something. Yeah.
Honestly, my biggest worry about this is, I'm an evidence-based person. Is the reason I came up with this project, frankly, was because I'm not supposed to be here. What I mean by that is I'm not supposed to be in a business school. I'm supposed to be in a liberal arts school. Before I was at Georgetown, I was at Brown. I was in the philosophy department and political. I was a pre-doctoral fellow and postdoc in their political science department. The philosophy department hired me as assistant professor, and that's where I'm supposed to be. And then I got hired by a business school to teach business students, and I went, I don't know any. I mean, I've been in business briefly, but I don't know about teaching business students. And I looked a lot into the research on, I'm like, how do you teach them? It must be different from teaching liberal arts people. And I looked heavily into the research on the pedagogy of business and what people actually learn. And then I learned, oh no, I've been doing it wrong my whole career. I was doing it wrong at Brown. Adult learners don't learn the way we think they do. Trying to train everybody to become a junior philosopher is not really all that valuable to them. And I say as a person who loves that stuff. So a lot of it is based upon this background research, but frankly, the downside of it is, I think for this to really be effective as it could be, it needs to be something done multiple times over multiple courses. There's this theory that says really people need to do something like 3 times for it really to click. So I can tell you stories about people emailing me a decade later and saying like, this is amazing, it changed my life. And I'm sure other professors are getting that about things that they do too. And it's true. But what I really want to do, if I could in the long run, is have everybody do this multiple times. And there's some talk about making it kind of a junior year or maybe even senior year experience for undergrads. Like they'll all do it at MSB at some point. But we're not there yet. But I think, so yeah, I think it's helpful, but I don't want to exaggerate the impact it has, because if it's a one-shot thing in one class, I do have people who take 3 classes with me so they can do it 3 times. But if it's a one-shot thing in one class, I would guess that the impact is not as high as it could be.
Hi, this is Mara.
Hi, Mara.
I am so thrilled that you have this class. And I have a couple of questions. I got my MBA a long time ago, and they were just at Stern, and they were just beginning to have social entrepreneurship, social venture as a concept. I loved it. I'm thrilled to hear that we have it at Georgia. I'm curious if it's become like a minor, or if there's other classes, ancillary classes, that if this is something that students can, actually, I don't even know if entrepreneurship in and of itself is something that students can major in the undergrad. And then I have a follow-on question. Is there?
We have a minor program in it, and a bunch of funding and things like Bark Tank and these other competitions for it. So
Yeah,
it probably won't become a major, but we do have a series of classes. And I teach a class on social entrepreneurship, not this coming year, but usually once a year.
Great. So I think it's come so far, and I loved your computer example that you had given, because I remember just very much when I was learning, it was all about, it was all about the triple bottom line, but it was like how, if you were up, and here's my friend, that's why I was off video. But it was all about the triple bottom line and giving money, like, kind of taking the Tom's example of buy one, give one, or just donating money from your profit or your revenue streams to a charity of choice. But I love how the computer example is a little bit more forward thinking in terms of it being core to the business model. And I don't know just if the thinking has changed, and when you're teaching it, is the concept more just about do good wherever you can do good, or is it really in the social entrepreneurship class about having it be part of your core business model?
Yeah, we really try to push the second thing, because you're right. There is a model that's just, we're going to raise profit and we're going to have a conventional business and then give some money away. And sometimes
Right.
it's conventional business and we're going to use the fact that we're giving money away as a way of attracting customers.
Yeah.
You know, which is a very seductive thing for business. I'm sure you've seen this in business yourself. It's like Anheuser-Busch gave away like $1 million worth of water to victims of the Houston hurricane, and then spent $5 million advertising that. And granted, that's a wonderful thing for them to do. It's way more water than I gave, and I can't complain about it. But there is a kind of it's a degree of patting oneself on the back and using it as a marketing tool. One of the complaints about like ESG recently is that a lot of businesses are just saying that they are, and it's hard to measure. And that's one reason I like a secondary model of, no, we're going to look at the kind of thing a charity or a government or an NGO would typically do, and we will do the same thing, but as a business. We will just solve the problem. And even right now, I have one of my research students is trying to figure something out like this for, say, mental health issues. She's saying there's certain underserved communities. She's a member of one of those communities that just where people don't consume a lot of mental health services. There's just of it, and she wants to try to make a for-profit business that will provide those services in a cost-effective way that people would normally consume.
Yeah.
Her argument is just, it's not that profit's bad, profit's fine, but it's like, this will make me beholden to my customer. So,
and like there's such a need and there's so much demand, therefore I will make money and be able to be self-sustaining because of the need of whatever that, that business is.
Yeah.
I had started a company. I'm not even going to go into it, but it was very much the first, like, it was a company for new mothers. And so I was like, I'm going to support new mothers that are in need more. And it did end up becoming much more of a use of marketing versus like it feeling really true to the company. But I love that you're doing this. I love that Georgetown has this. I would love to see more of it and for students to be able to minor in it. There was no business plan competition. There was no entrepreneurship when I was there. So I'm thrilled to see that it's changed and evolved.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I think Judy and then Megan is the order.
Sorry if I jumped in. I didn't see a cue. I didn't know. I think I just jumped in. Sorry about that.
It's your, I think you're on your phone, so that affects things, but no worries about it. We're all buddies here, right?
Hi. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm not a Georgetown alum. I somehow got on the mailing list because I live in the Boston area and I'm a parent of an MSB undergraduate, sophomore. So, and I am also a professional fundraiser at another university, at Brandeis. So I just thought the topic was so interesting. I'm pretty sure my son has not taken the class with you because I think I would have heard about it, but I've been texting him throughout to say, I don't know if you know this guy, but you've got to take his class. So I hope he'll have an opportunity someday. But I just wonder, as a professional fundraiser for a university, if you, in your position, have been called upon by the development office at Georgetown to work with them to raise money and to sit in front of donors, and how that experience was for you, given all that you've shared today.
It's funny they haven't done that.
I should.
I have met with people before after they've given money and so on, but not before. Brown would trot me out to New York all the time. I was younger or prettier back then. I don't know what it was. Georgetown doesn't tend to do that as much.
Really?
Frankly, how do I put it? My previous dean, I mentioned before, David Thomas. What a great guy he was. I love that guy. I could spend an hour talking about how wonderful he was. I love our current dean too. Paul Almeida is amazing as well. But after he'd been here a year, I asked him, like, what is the biggest surprise to you about Georgetown? He had come from Harvard's business school, and he said how bad we are at asking and getting money and receiving it. He said our architecture for that is just really like poor compared to Harvard's. And granted, Harvard's obviously a fundraising machine. That's the main thing that they do. So maybe there's something to do with it. I'm not really sure why that is. I think there's a hunger for it. I think alumni and others are interested in pedagogy and like sort of seeing how they can make the experience better for students. They had what was good for it for them. They like to see more of that, but they also knew what was missing, and they'd like to see even more of that. And I don't know what determines what the focus is. But if some alumni development person is listening to this or sees this later and says, you know, Jay, I'd like you to go talk to some donor who'd like to like do more of this stuff, I'm happy to help. I'm available. I just haven't done much of it for whatever reason.
You'd be great. So
Yeah, I hope so.
I met the guy, I forgot his name, the development guy for MSB, and at family weekend, I have his card, so I'm gonna write to him.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, see, I don't even know who it is. Yeah, and that's probably not his fault. That's probably mine. One thing about us professors is that we are very much in our small little circus. I'll be walking across campus even now, and I've been there for 12 years, and some parent will come up to me and go, do you know where the such and such building is? And I'm like, I'm sorry, only the names of 9 buildings. You know, it's up to 9 now. It used to be 3.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Megan.
Thanks, Jason. I really enjoyed hearing what you said tonight. I think you should bring it over to the law school. That's where I was. My question is, I did the Peace Corps like 100 years ago. I was in Ecuador, and I felt like I kind of learned how to, the examples in failing, like you don't do what you think people need, you do what the people on the ground actually need. But now at my job, they want me to start looking at charities to see where it's a financial securities company. They want to know where they can put their money. Can you provide us after this call with some of the literature, either that you've written yourself? I know you did mention the elephant book, or just, I'd love some guidance on taking some of these ideas and putting it into practice.
Let me type it into the chat real quick. There's 2 really good, or one thing is something called givewell.org, and then there's a book called Doing Good Better. Right. So that first one's a website. The second one's a book. So Doing Good Better is a book by William McGaskill, who's one of the sort of founders of the effective altruist movement. And it's all about what works and what doesn't, and how you measure it. So there's some abstract stuff, but there's some real good resources, and particular resources as well. GiveWell is a charity aggregator that's very different from others. So a lot of charity aggregators will do things like, this company has a lot of overhead, this one doesn't, therefore the one with less overhead is good. That's not really true, because some things that are really effective require a lot of overhead, right? You have to pay, like brain surgery does a lot of good, but you have to pay a surgeon. And some things that are not that effective just don't require a lot of overhead. What they do is very rigorous evidence-based cost benefit analysis. Like, what is the actual, if you give this group $1, what will they do with it? What effect will it have on people? What does that do for them? You know, so it's something like, how many more years of life will this person get as a result of the money that they get from this charity? Can we put a dollar value on that? It sounds mean to say that, but can we put a dollar value on the life that they're living? And if we did, like, what would it work out to be? And so the nice thing about them is they have charities that they recommend. I've often, like when I was the director of our a partnership program we had with freshman consulting, I would sometimes use GiveWell to decide like which charity we would work with. But not only have the charities they recommend, but they have a method and some statistics that, and like things you can just take out and use yourself. And I think especially from like a venture capital standpoint, a lot of the metrics that you would use to evaluate a business, like what's its long-term impact, what's the probability of this and that, it's the same kind of stuff that's just applied to charity. And you really do get things like, wow, this one charity that deworms children, if you give them $100, they will do $2,000 worth of good. It's amazing, right? If you give it to this other charity, if you give them $100, they'll do $100 worth of good. That's not to say it's not worth doing. All good is worth doing. That's like what it means to be good. But given our limited resources, you know, sometimes just trying to get bigger bang for the buck, I think is a really great idea, because there are these overlooked things. So I would really look at those. I think the 2 of them combined, I think would be really helpful, especially, you know, given your background. I think a lot of the tools that they use are things that are going to be very natural for you.
Thanks so much. I'll check them out.
Yeah, great.
So I'll just ask a couple, this was fantastic and I think really timely. So I'll go with the Andrew Clark pet peeve of like the last 5 years, which is all of the social media kind of grandstanding where, you know, if you put up a picture frame or you put a flag in your profile or, you know, whatever, and therefore people feel like they're doing something meaningful, to me has always felt very self-serving as opposed to actually appropriate. And I hope I'm not offending anybody, but such is how I feel about such things. And, you know, to me, it just seems like your talk kind of spoke directly to that as, you know, you're not really doing anything meaningful, but you're making yourself feel better about yourself. So I was wondering if you had any particular perspective direct to that kind of what seems to be a movement in the social good space of, if I just put it up in my profile picture, then I've done good today.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm like you. I have that same impulse, but just to speak to the other side, sometimes saying we care about things this can be worth it sometimes. But you're right. There's a lot of grandstanding. Have you read that book, Grandstanding, by any chance?
I have not actually, but I've written it down, so I'm going to put it on my list.
There's a really good book called Grandstanding by actually a person we had as a postdoc at Georgetown, Justin Tosi. I'll write that down too. Grandstanding by Justin Tosi and Brandon Warmke. I'll put that in the chat. I misspelled it, but you'll get it. I put it in the chat in case you're interested in that. So grandstanding is this idea that we sometimes use moral language for the purposes of self-promotion. Right? I'm trying to make sure I look better than other people. And this can be really pernicious. It can be things like, the story of the Princess of the Pea, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we all look at something and I spot a moral error and you don't, that's evidence that I'm better than you. I'm more morally sensitive. If I'm intolerant, oh, you can tolerate that, but I can't. That's evidence I'm better, and so on and so forth. So all these kind of bad mechanisms where we become jerks about ethics. And unfortunately, a lot of business advertisement is like that. You take good ideas like ESG or triple bottom line or social entrepreneurship, and they turn into slogans that are used for the purposes of grandstanding rather than really helping. So I think what's nice about EA, and it has lots and lots of flaws too. We could talk for hours about that as well. But what's nice about EA is very much an insistence on prove it. You say you're doing good, prove it. Prove it was worth it. Prove you're actually helping. Like, don't just show me a picture, prove it, right? It's because it's in a sense, it's not about praying in public, right? If you're praying in public, are you just trying to make people think you're pious? Or is that what you're doing? Or are you actually trying to do something good? So really I agree with you. And I'd like to see more of that ourselves. I think even, we try to keep the MSB as honest as we can about this too. When they say, we stand for all these values, and my colleagues and I are like, great, we're going to make sure you deliver then. We're going to call you out if you don't, and we're going to really force you to put your money where your mouth is and get the results that you say you are. If you say you care about these things, then we have people coming here because we say we stand for something. So we have an obligation to deliver that thing. So yes, I completely agree with you. You're on my side.
Oh, good. Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Great.
Just one last question. Jason, do you network with other professors who essentially propagate the same ideas, or are you still in a small space here at Georgetown doing this?
Yeah, at Georgetown itself, I feel like it's relatively small. We have more and more people who are doing these in their classes. Now, basically, all my colleagues are doing it in one class or another. And there are other professors doing similar kinds of projects in a way in their classes, but they're usually more directed rather than open. But I think a lot of these ideas are spread around many different universities. As I mentioned, I'm funding about 19 universities to do it, to do this project exactly. And then others are copying it as well without even getting funding from us. And so I think many schools are doing this or something like it in response to these kinds of concerns. They're worried about teaching people to be active agents. I feel like it's not just business schools, it's schools of foreign service, it's schools of nursing, it's other places where they know people are going to go into certain practical disciplines, and they're trying to get away from simple lecture-based learning to experiential learning of the right sort. And the problem of experiential learning can be, it's a contrived experience that's overly curated and nothing is at risk. And really good experiential learning is risky. Even this project, we didn't get into this, but I remember I gave a talk on this at something called the Aspen Undergraduate Business Consortium, and one of not our deputy dean, but an associate dean of something or other was there with me. And a professor, or actually a dean from Cornell, raised his hand and said, wait, your project has moral risk, because here's an example project. Students made t-shirts that said Hoya Drinking Club. On the back, it had a beer pong stack, and it said, you sink them, we drink them. And they sold $1,100 worth of shirts. We made a $700 profit. And these are freshmen in college. And after they did this as a project, they said, I told you the lawyer specifically said, no, sex, drugs, or rock and roll. It's a direct quote from the lawyers. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because we're a Catholic university. Please don't do that. And you did it anyway. And beer pong leads to all sorts of problems, and excessive drinking leads to all sorts of problems. And you did these shirts. And it was a great learning experience. I'm glad they did it. We had a great talk. But then the administrator's eyes lit up and she said, oh, there's risk. I'm like, yes, but there needs to be, because in a way, a risk-free environment is an environment in which people learn. It's true of sports. You can't learn to really run I'll use football because I play football. You can't really learn to run as a running back unless someone's going to tackle you, right? And it has to hurt a little bit. So I think the key is sort of threading the line, or just right, where you're giving them enough moral risk to learn from, but not so much that there's a catastrophe if they make a mistake. And so at least with this project, there's a lot of controls built in, not with me telling them what to do, but like literally just the fact they have to get up in front of everybody and talk about what they did for 25 minutes at the end of the semester. That is an amazing control on students. It really prevents them from doing anything that would be terrible. Other colleagues of mine that are copying this project elsewhere, they might veto a project if they don't like it or require them to submit it ahead of time. But yeah, I think, everything you said made me think of this, the moral risk issue and why it's important for students.
Excellent. Great.
Any other
questions? Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, a special thank you to you, Professor Brennan. This was a fantastic topic. Really, really very interesting. Makes me wish I was an adult and could go back to class and enjoy all my free time again. But really, really thank you. Thank you to all the participants tonight. A special thank you to Mario and Lily for really taking the lead on this event and having this come to fruition. And Professor, I think just the next goal is to have you do this live for us in person here in Boston, and get a crowd together and enjoy a live session. So, but really, really appreciate your time. Best wishes for your continued success on this project. And, please let us know how the alumni community can continue to help and support your efforts, as I think you do some really important work for the McDonough School. And as a proud MSBer myself, I have a unique interest in that as well. So.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I'm delighted to spend this time with you. I'm delighted with your interest in it. It's always gratifying as a professor to hear about what you do, because you don't always get that. So thanks so much. And yeah, I'd love to come back and come back to Boston and see you all in person.
Wonderful. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew.